Have you ever had a deal that looked healthy while the seller was involved, but started to slow down the moment the champion had to take the conversation back into their own organization? The calls went well, the solution made sense, and there was real interest. Then finance asked for a stronger case. IT wanted more details on implementation and security. A senior leader wanted to understand the commercial upside. And suddenly the champion was trying to carry the whole deal internally with a sales deck, a few notes, and whatever they could remember from the last conversation. This is where a lot of a promising opportunity get lost. Not necessarily because the solution is wrong, but because the buying group cannot align, assess the risk, or make the next decision confidently. And that is the problem buyer enablement content, I believe, is meant to solve, if approached correctly. When I refer to buyer enablement content, though, I don't mean like simply assets for the seller to present. They are practical, shareable resources that help the buyer explain the problem, build the case, align stakeholder, and move the decision forward when the seller is not in the room. I've created a full guide and one-pager visual covering 8 core buyer enablement assets, where they tend to fit across the buyer journey and the role enablement plays in making them usable. I will link those below if you want to explore the full set and the guidance for building each one. Here, though, I want to focus on the implementation side. The answer doesn't lie in looking at the list of assets and deciding that your team now needs to build all of them. That is probably the fastest route to create another content library that seller will not use. Instead, you should focus on what is making it difficult for buyers to move forward in your deals and what is the smallest asset that could help remove that friction. In other words, you diagnose the buyer side problem first. You select the asset second. Then you build a small version, test it in real opportunity, and see whether it helps the buyer and your deals make progress. So I'll say that the best place to start with creating effective buyer enablement content in your recent deals is choosing a small sample of stalled, lost, or slow-moving opportunities and look at where the buying process started to break down. The question I will ask are, where did momentum slow? Which stakeholder lacked clarity or confidence? What did the champion need to explain internally? What decision could the buying group not make? And what information proof was actually missing? So the reason this is important is that different forms of buyer friction require, of course, different assets. If nobody is clear on the next steps, owners, or let's say dates, the answer may be a mutual action plan. If the champion is struggling to get a senior executive interested, an executive brief may be more useful. If finance wants a defensible investment case, you may need a business case. If the buyer likes the solution but worries about rollout effort, the missing piece may be an implementation roadmap. And if the buying group cannot agree on how to compare vendors, a decision criteria scorecard as well may help. And if important stakeholder missed the live product demonstration, an interactive demo may give them a way to explore the product without another round of scheduling. So the one page that I propose includes the broader set of assets and maps them across the buyer journey, which help you sense check when they tend to become useful. But timing alone should not determine what you build. The friction should determine that instead. For example, imagine you review 5 recent enterprise deals and discover that 3 of them slowed down when the CFO became involved. In each case, the champion understood the value but could not explain the assumptions, payback, and financial impact clearly enough to secure approval. That point then towards a business case as the potential solution here. It does not point towards building an interactive demo, a new customer story, or a security pack all at once. The first step is to address the repeated problem you can already see. The sequence I recommend is this. You review the deals, you identify the repeated friction, you find the stakeholder affected, and then select the assets most likely to help those stakeholders make the next decision or action. When taking this initial step, the smallest useful tangible output you could create is what I would call a buyer enablement gap map. This is a very simple working document that connects recurring deal friction to the asset that could help resolve it. You don't need a sophisticated platform or perfect CRM data. You start with, let's say, 5 opportunities or even 10 and a basic table. For each deal, you want to capture the opportunity and the stage, where the buying process slowed, which stakeholder was affected, what evidence you have from the deal, what asset was used, if any, what asset appeared to be missing, and what do you want to test next. So let me give you a few examples. You have an enterprise opportunity where the champion could not secure CFO approval. The evidence is repeated requests for clear assumptions and payback. The missing asset is probably a business case. Your next test might be a 2-page business case used in the next 3 finance-led opportunity. Then you have another deal. A pilot continued for weeks without a clear decision. The missing asset may be a pilot plan that defines the business questions, success criteria, owners and dates, and the final decision before the pilot ever begins. In a third deal, IT, operations, and finance are all comparing vendors using different criteria. Then my point towards a decision criteria scorecard co-created early enough that the buying group can align on what matters before final evaluation. The point of the gap map is not to prove that you need more content. It is to help you choose the most useful test you could run with the identified type of asset. Suppose 4 of the 5 deals slowed because buyers were unsure what implementation would be required. You now have a clear hypothesis. A simple implementation roadmap may help buyers understand the effort, ownership timing, and the path to value. From there, you create the smallest version that could be useful. It could be a single page showing 4 or 5 phases, the main buyer and vendor responsibility, some of the key milestones, 2 or 3 risks, and the first points where the buyer should expect to see the value. The same applies to other assets. A minimum viable executive brief might contain the problem in the buyer's own language, the intended outcome, a small number of quantified benefits, and the explicit decision or support required. A minimum viable mutual action plan might contain 8 milestones, named owner, target dates, any dependencies, and the current status of things. A customer story may be 1 page showing the customer situation, what changed thanks to utilizing your solution, and 2 or 3 credible results. This is enough to test whether the asset could help the conversation. Yet, there is another important aspect to consider. The asset itself is only one part of the output, right? The rep also needs to understand how to introduce them in the deal. For example, instead of sending a mutual action plan as an attachment and saying, here is our map template, the rep might say, would it be useful if we map the key internal steps, owners, and decision dates together so both sides have a clear view of what needs to happen? The right framing is often the difference between an asset feeling like sales administration, it feeling generally useful to the buyer. Now, let's stop for a moment and talk about how to adapt this approach to different environments. In general, the core implementation logic should remain consistent. First, diagnose the friction, then select the asset, build the smallest useful version, help seller use it properly, and inspect whether it supports deal progress and it has an impact and influence on the sales cycle. Depending on your context, what may change is more about the depth of the system. If you have a shorter sales cycle, a smaller buying group, or a relatively low value transaction, keep the asset set very light. You may only need a concise executive brief, a relevant customer story or a few of those, a short implementation timeline, and a commercial summary. For a mixed mid-market enterprise motion, I will create triggers based on deal condition rather than forcing every seller to use every asset. For example, use an executive brief when serial alignment is needed. Use a customer story when risk or credibility becomes a major concern, or whether you want to be proactive about this. Use a mutual action plan when deal becomes generally multi-stakeholders and things need to be coordinated more intentionally. Use an implementation roadmap when the buyer starts asking about adoption effort or time to value. Use a business case when finance or formal approval becomes active. This gives the seller a smaller and more relevant set of choices, so it nudges them towards the right type of asset. In a complex enterprise motion, buyer enablement becomes more of an operating system. You may have different asset variants for finance, IT, operation, and other executive audiences. You may create trigger inside the CRM or even an AI copilot. You may maintain proof points libraries by industry, use case, and outcome. A manager may inspect buyer enablement during deal reviews. An asset may live inside a digital sales room where the buyer can access the latest version and the seller can see engagement and make decisions based on that. So the one-pager that I propose captures this broader view through the section on enablement's role, the templates, the training, the coaching, and the workflow integration that are all needed to work together to enable and allow reps to utilize buyer enablement content effectively. But even in a more mature environment, it's also important to understand that we should not want to create complexity unless it helps the buyer decide. That should be the North Star always. Now, the immediate next step I would recommend, taking from what I've discussed in this video so far, is a 60-minute buyer friction review. You want to bring together one sales manager and two experienced sellers. Choose 5 recent deals that stalled, were lost, or progressed more slowly than expected. Then review each one using the same question. Where did the buying process lose momentum? Which stakeholder struggled to act, decide, or align? What did the champion need to explain internally? What asset was used, and which asset might have reduced that friction that you identified. So once you have reviewed all 5, look for the repeated pattern. Choose the most common one and define a small asset test. Let's say 3 of the 5 deals slowed because buyers were uncertain about implementation effort and time to value. Your test could be to create a one-page implementation roadmap, using the next 3 enterprise opportunities where implementation concern appear. So the first version, it will include the phases, buyer and vendor responsibility, any major risks, milestones, and value realization points. The rep introduced it by saying something like, would it help if we mapped what implementation could look like and where your team could need to be involved? The manager then checks whether it was co-created, whether buyer concern were added, and whether it led to a clearer next actions. So you review the result after 3 uses or within, let's say, 30 days. And then before the session ends, you agree on a few points. Who owns the first version? Which seller will contribute field input? What is the minimum content that we need to create? Which deals will be used for the test? How should sellers introduce it? And what will the manager inspect? And finally as well, when will you review what happened as a whole? Okay, this is enough to move from an interesting concept to a real implementation test. And ultimately, you're trying to prove that one well-chosen assets can make one recurrent buyer decision easier and therefore speed up the sales cycle. Once they work, you may consider improving the specific asset and then repeat the same process with the next source of friction that could be addressed with another type of asset. The main takeaway I want to leave you with is that you should not approach buyer enablement by asking what content your sales team should have. You begin by asking what is making it difficult for the buyer to move forward and to make the right decision for their business. Then you choose one recurring point of friction, build one small asset around it, support seller in using it, and test whether it helps the buying group make the next decision and take action more readily. So the full guide and the one-page visual are linked below. They go deeper into the 8 most impactful buyer enablement assets for most sales cycle, how each one is built, where it fits across the buyer journey, and how enablement can support adoption through templates, training, coaching, and workflow integration. Thank you for staying with me all the way through, and I hope you found this useful. I'll see you in the next video.